Good morning, dear friends. It is Thursday, the 26th of Tevis, December 30th. We're here to study the Talmud, the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. We'll start off with our prayerful wishes for good health, perfect health for the dear members of our Chabura and their households, and all of Am Yisrael, for a time with Menuchas HaNefesh, peace of mind, health, and joy. We particularly mention the names that are on our list for complete and speedy recovery. Hold on, I lost my. So we're mentioning the Refuah Shlema, Leah Bas Rita, Malka Bas Rivka, Chaim Baruch Eliezer Ben Esther, Mil Bas Najada, and all of Klal Yisrael. Today we had in Shul, we mentioned the yard site of a good friend, David Zinger's father-in-law, whose name was, and let me see if I can get this right, Baruch Chaim Ben Bruria. The interesting thing, I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, is that his father-in-law was called Baruch Chaim, and his father was called Chaim Baruch. I've never heard of that before, but so, anyways. But the main thing is we're gathered here, we're studying the Gemara, and we're going to start a new Mishnah today, and we are presently at the tail end of chapter 10 of Masechet Shabbos, Perek HaMatzniah. And the bulk of our discussions this chapter have revolved around facets of carrying, what you're carrying, why you're carrying it, and how you're carrying it. The last two Mishnahs, we pivoted to talk about three Mishnahs. We pivoted to talk of other activities that are restricted on Shabbos, and they're certainly none of the activities mentioned, the work, labor mentioned, are explicitly in the Mishkan, and so at the most they are a tolda, an offshoot, or a rabbinic restriction. And today we're going to introduce another topic that is prevalent in Shas, but I don't believe we've encountered it yet. And so let us share the screen, let us begin. And it is so special to have everyone here along for the ride. Some of you, I imagine, may have visitors or are traveling or are dealing otherwise with stuff, and yet you choose to come on to the Gemara, Chabura, to help inform and enrich this discussion. And for that, I thank you. So here we go. The screen has been shared, and we are now Masechet Shabbos, Tzadik, Hey, Amud Aleph, and in a moment, Tzadik, Hey, Amud Beis, 95A, in the moment, 95B. And again, this is another topic, just like last Mishnah, which is going to seem entirely like it's coming from left field. And we'll see. Here we go. So until now, we've been talking about spin-offs of building, sorting, cutting or uprooting. What else? What were the other malachis? Boina, sweeping, spritzing water, and the like. Now we're going to talk about something else. Talking about tolesh, uprooting something that is growing, vegetation. Is that allowed on Shabbos? Are you allowed to pluck a plant or a fruit from the tree? Or can you pluck a fruit from the ground? Of course, the answer is no. That's one of the central and primary malachas. But what if it gets complicated? And in our Mishnah, things are about to get a little bit complicated. Because hatoilesh me'atzitz nakuv. What if you uproot, you sever, you pluck a plant, a leaf, a fruit from a plant that's growing in a flower pot that has a hole in it? So before we get into what it is and why there'd be anything different, let's see the halacha chayiv. A person is chayiv, a person is liable, a person is not allowed, a person is biblically in trouble for plucking a plant from a flower plant that is perforated and connected to the ground. But if you have a flower pot that is not at all connected to the ground, there's no hole in it, it is entirely separate, sealed. So then, says the Mishnah Pater, one may possibly avoid a biblical Shabbos prohibition. Again, the why is a heavy why, and we'll see it soon. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with our Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with the first statement here, which is ostensibly from Rabbi Yehuda. And he says, Poiter bazeh ubazeh. A plant growing in a flower pot, whether it is perforated, whether there's a hole in it, whether there's no hole in it, plucking the leaf, removing the plant is not considered biblical Shabbos desecration. So as I said, this Mishnah seems to come totally out of left field. We weren't talking about planting. We certainly weren't talking about a flower pot that's perforated or not, but that's where we are. We're on to explore another possible Dirabanan or Deoraita, a biblical or rabbinic prohibition on Shabbos. Let's see Rashi for our first clue. What would be the deal with a perforated, a punctured flower pot? So long as there is a hole in the flower pot, well, even though there is a bottom, which is solid, which ostensibly separates the plant from the ground, the puncture, the hole, creates a connection, and it's the yonek min hakarka. The plants absorb nutrients not only from the earth that's in the flower pot, but it also absorbs nutrients from the earth below it. Al yidei hanekev, via the puncture. Because the moisture conducts, brings, transports somehow nutrients through a hole into the pot. And so the plant is growing maybe in this space of the flower pot, but it's getting nourishment and from the broader ground. And therefore, by uprooting it, it's like you're uprooting a plant from the ground. And now Rashi drops a big bomb. Even if the puncture is not on the bottom of the pot, but even if it is on the side of the pot, it is still considered connected to the ground. So basically, in short, we're talking about a little bit of a chiddush.
So I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm here. I got in about 15 seconds ago, and I already have a question.
Good.
So a nekev bedofno, even if it has a hole on the side. Now I can understand if the hole is on the bottom, towards the bottom third, but how far up does he consider a hole on the side to be the chubar lekarka?
So we'll see some discussion. It's a good question. There's a lot of questions. In general, at this point, I'd say there's a whole lot more questions than answers. So we have no choice, or I have no choice. Let's try to take it step by step. Let's see how the Gemara unfolds, because we have to come to this Mishnah with little previous knowledge, and let's let the Gemara fill in the blanks and Rashi, and then we'll try to put it all together and see Rashi. We can only take what Rashi has to offer. Rashi doesn't tell us that if the puncture is all the way in the top, because let's say you have a flower pot that's three quarters full of earth. Well, what if the hole is on top of where the earth is? At all, is that considered punctured? I just want to to confuse us a little more. What if a perforated pot is not touching the ground? What if it's suspended and it's just like hanging over the ground? Is that somehow considered connected to the ground? We have so little data, we have so little facts, we have so little information. All we have is what the Mishnah says. And what the Mishnah says is if the pot is punctured, perforated, it's considered attached to the ground. And so taking a plant out of the pot is akin to taking the plant off the ground. And Rabbi Shimon says,
you have hydroponics where it does not even have, it doesn't even have to be connected to the ground.
Exactly. But there it's not sitting in a pot, I don't think. I think it's suspended somehow with a... So let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz. If you sever a plant or a fruit from that grows in a flower pot, as a plant in a flower pot with holes in it, has the legal status of a plant connected to the ground. Picking from it is prohibited due to reaping. And if you pick from an unperforated pot, one is exempt biblically, but it's prohibited to do so, lechatchila. And Rabbi Shimon says both instances it's considered separate from the ground. As if to say, and it is saying, that a plant growing in a flower pot is not the same as doesn't have the same halachic status of a plant as if it is on the ground. And that's something else we want to understand. Why? How is that so? But for now, we have to accept what the Mishnah is telling us. There are here before giving a lot of clarity, I just want to tell you on this topic, there are many, many different shitot, many different rishonim, many different early medieval commentators that have different nuanced and takes on what exactly the parameters or what exactly the scenario of the punctured flower pot is. Why a flower pot is not considered a regular growing plant, perhaps because that's an atypical manner of growing plants long-term, and therefore it doesn't have the typical form of the malacha of plucking. Of course, lemaisa lahalacha, we're not allowed to do that. What it is doesn't make a difference what material the flower pot is made of. Is also an important question that we haven't discussed yet, but it's discussed vigorously in the Rishonim. By the way, if you put a plant in a flower pot that has a hole, if you let it go long enough, you'll find the roots find their way through that hole, right? Why is that? So you might say the roots grow everywhere and they just go out where there's a hole, but I think there's more to it. I think the plant has some ability to go after the most rich and nourishing soil. I don't know how that works. Again, this is where maybe we need Alan, but it is so therefore one could make the case that the plant gets information from the hole. All right, I'm gonna be silent. There's some comments here, but I think Professor goes first.
Of course, well, not of course. I think that they didn't have pots for flour when they were building the Mishkan. So this is the situation which is quite removed from the source of all prohibitions. However, another consideration besides reaping might be the effect of taking the leaf on the growth of the plant. And that's also a biblically prohibited work, regardless of whether they had pots in the Mishkan or not.
Professor, you're reminding us of an important point, which is many times, weeding or pruning is not considered harvesting, it's considered planting because it makes the plant more viable. So I think what you're telling us is that besides for the fact that you're plucking a leaf off the plant, it's possible that you're actually enhancing its ability to grow. Very interesting. I hadn't considered that, so I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, so that's something else we need to consider. Rebel's in queue. Professor, you had something else? I'm sorry, I interjected here. Oh, shkoyach for adding that to the conversation. Thank you. Rebel?
Rabbi, this seems to be a whole different category because everything else we considered is, you're cleaning the floor, and by cleaning the floor, you're doing something, you're wearing jewelry, you want to look better. You have a plant, it's Shabbos, leave it alone. Matzricha here.
Of course you should leave it alone. But what if you forgot to leave it alone? We're talking about do you do a chatas? And we also need to have the absolute definition of the malacha. Even if you shouldn't do it, we're not saying you should do it. You're still patur of al-asr. You are exempt from the biblical consequences. But here, this is an academic discussion to get clear of the exact parameters of what is a malacha, what is a biblically restricted or prohibited activity on Shabbos. So you're right. When it comes to lemaisa, we should all control ourselves and just leave the flower plant for 25 hours or whatever. Let it grow. In general, you shouldn't tinker too much with the plant, besides for when you're trying to help it out. But it is what it is. Just to point out, koitzer is the word that we usually use in the 39 malachas. Koitzer means to reap, to cut, and koitzer usually means with an implement. The word toilish, by definition, is a description of the same activity, but doing it by hand. So you could be koitzer, you could harvest grain with a sickle, and you could be toilish, you could pluck an apple from the tree, and you can pluck a leaf off the tree, and And that seems to be the distinction between the two words, but they mean more or less the same thing. So the question basically is, if a plant in a pot holder gets nourishment from the ground, do we consider it conceptually attached? And I was just trying to bring proof that it actually is impactful from the fact that the roots will find their way through that hole with time, meaning that obviously there is something significant and interesting for the plant to get from the ground. It is not satisfied with what's in the pot and in the planter alone. It's also fair, and I thought this is what I thought the professor was getting at, is that once upon a time it appears the agricultural process was much less dependent on flower pots, and today with an amateur interest in planting stuff, and in a society where we could afford to do it as a hobby as opposed to survive, there's a prevalence of people with flower pots, and you can get one in Winn-Dixie, or you can go to your local planting store or whatever. And so it is fair to say that I imagine once upon a time this was less of a common event. But we'll leave that. We'll let that simmer as well. There's a question if the word atzitznakov specifically means out of earthenware, which is how I assume and imagine it is based on what we experience as flower pots. But apparently there are opinions that say this is only if it's actually made of wood. There are viewpoints that say if it's made out of earthenware, even if there's no hole, it could be attached to the ground because it's of a similar substance. And earthenware may be porous in a kind of way that wood isn't. Although I guess on the flip side, maybe wood could be imagined to be more porous. And indeed, there are other opinions we'll see in Tosfos that make that case. So okay, not this Tosfos. All right, we're going to start the Gemara. And again, we still are missing a lot of data, but that's somewhat intentional. The Mishnah is vague, and we'll have to be comfortable with the vagueness that the Mishnah presents as we navigate the Gemara and attempt to gain some greater clarity. And interestingly enough, the initial conversation is going to be to some extent a side issue. So let's take a look. Rami. So, but what are the facts? The Mishnah states a perforated flower pot is a thing growing in a perforated flower pot is considered that the plant is growing in the ground. If it's growing in the ground, you biblically are prohibited from uprooting it. If it is not punctured, then for the purpose of the biblical malachos, it is not considered to be growing on the ground. And so midoraita, the Shabbos laws and the core 39 malachos do not cover this action of plucking a plant from a non-perforated flower pot. Again, we have a lot of questions. Where is the hole? What is the material of the flower pot? Why is it not considered a problem to pluck it from from the planter that it's growing in? All good questions, but this is what the Mishnah says. And Rabbi Shimon says, even if there's a hole in the flower pot, it is still considered in a separate space. Because I'm just going to imagine we'll do some conjecture, and then we'll see what the Gemara says. Maybe the Gemara will say differently. Let's be clear. A small perforation, a small hole in a flower pot, probably only accounts for a minute amount of nourishment, whereas most of the nourishment, most of the soil, most of the minerals that are going to be providing for this plant are going to be from the soil in the pot. Let's see the Gemara. Rami le Abaya le Rava. Abaya brought up what we'll find to be a contradiction between the words of Rabbi Shimon, and he shared this with Rava. V'amri la Rabbi Chia barav le Rav. Alternatively, Rabbi Chia brought this apparent contradiction to Rav. What is the contradiction? Tanan, our Mishnah says, Rabbi Shimon poiter bozeh bozeh. Rabbi Shimon says all kinds of flower pots, a person is exempt from the oraita act of plucking or harvesting whether it is perforated or not. From the words alone, Rabbi Shimon Poiter, bazeh o bazeh, Rabbi Shimon chooses to paskins that you are not biblically liable for desecrating Shabbos. Alma nakuv Rabbi Shimon. From here we can infer that Rabbi Shimon looks at a punctured hole, a perforated hole, to be a flower pot, just like an unperforated hole. He sees no halachic distinction between a flower pot that has a little hole in it or a flower pot that has no hole in it. That's what we can easily infer from our Mishnah. That's what we should infer from our Mishnah. So what's the problem? We have another text which records the teaching of Rabbi Shimon, and it seems to be in a kind of contradiction with this statement. Rabbi Shimon taught elsewhere a general teaching. Ein bein nakov l'she'einai nakov elo lahachshir zroyim bilvad. There is no difference between a pot that's punctured and a pot that's not punctured, with the exception of lahachshir zroyim, when it comes to making a plant to be considered tamei, able to be ritually impure. So what's this question? What is the contradiction? So here's how Rabbi Steinsaltz explains it. Apparently, in all other areas of halacha, Rabbi Shimon holds that a plant in a perforated pot has the same status as being attached Let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz's interpretation. We'll try to see some others. To be honest, I struggle a bit with this part of the Gemara. Seeds that are in a perforated pot have the legal status of seeds planted in the ground, and as such cannot become ritually impure. Seeds that are in an imperforated pot are considered detached from the ground and can become ritually impure. Apparently, in other areas of legal halacha, Rabbi Shimon holds that a plant in a perforated pot has the legal status of a plant in the ground. I don't see that personally. Let's see if Rashi helps us out.
What's the big contradiction? He believes they're the same except for.
That's what I'm telling you. That I'm struggling with this Gemara, and it seems like there are multiple ways to understand the question. I think the simple reading is that either Rabbi Shimon says there is no difference, which is what he said right over here, ein bein nakov l'sheni nakov, which means he always equates the two to be identical. Whereas in this earlier text where he says poiter bazeh bazeh, he says that you're exempt in both places. It seems that usually they are different, and that's why he has to come and make a customized teaching. In this scenario, they are identical. Again, I'm not thrilled with this explanation, but I think this is this is like the simple explanation. Either Rabbi Shimon believes that they are always the same halacha, and he doesn't need to give the statement bazeh u bazeh. He should have just said the halacha of the perforated pot, or he could have just, or he does have distinctions. This is not what Rashi is saying, but this is, I think, how some explain it. Here, let's see what this. We'll see over here. Rabbi Shimon Kamar Le v'Hachi Gasin. Rabbi Shimon Amar Ein Bein Nakov. The L'Rabbanan Katuv the Mechayev. Yeah, I'll read for you what it says over here. Maybe someone here can help me figure this out. In all matters, perforated and not perforated are the same, with the exception of plants. Okay, here's a third interpretation. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon says there's no difference. It seems to be like a blanket statement of common halacha. Whereas in this brisa that was introduced here, he does distinguish between them. So suffice it to say, there seems to be a little bit of friction in exactly how we'll put together all of, or not all. There's a little bit of friction. Seems to be not a little bit imperfect or it seems to be awkward between different texts where Rabbi Shimon expresses his viewpoint about perforated flower pots. Does he see them to be identical to an unperforated flower pot or not? Again, I think if you look at every sefer I've looked at has given a slightly varied way to understand this question, but I think we'll leave it at that. There's something not seamless, not perfect, not smooth between these different texts of Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara answers, Amar Lei. Rava answers to Abaya. L'chomili Rabbi Shimon kitolish mashvili. You want to know the truth of Rabbi Shimon's viewpoint? He always views a perforated flower pot as utterly detached from the ground and to be just like a unpunctured flower pot. B'shani le'inyan tuma. When it comes to ritual purity and impurity, it's an entirely different genre of halacha, and it's only there where he makes the distinction. Because there's a verse in the Torah that describes ritual impurity, and it singles out zrayim, it singles out seeds. So therefore, there's one space in halacha where we'll treat a flower pot that is punctured differently than a flower pot that is not punctured. Shenemar al kol zera zerua asher yizoreya. So basically, the Gemara seems to be explaining what I understood lichatchila, which is that Rabbi Shimon generally looks at the two pots to be identical, with the exception of zrayim, with the exception of plants. So when we say that Rabbi Shimon is poiter bazel bazeh, he generally views perforated and non-perforated plants to be identical, with one exception. Again, I'll say it again. I struggle a little bit to understand the question. The question doesn't seem to me, and maybe I'm missing something. There's something. The question isn't such a bothersome question, and the answer seems to be a reframing of what we already could have understood by just reading the two texts. Possibly there were other versions of the Gemara that had slightly different, had the brises slightly different, and therefore some of the data that we already had is only conveyed in the text of the Gemara. But that is that.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Maybe because the laws of Tuma, as we learned, is, whether water can escape in between the person, the garment, the hair, etc., to toivel it. Maybe that's the area that's going on here.
Maybe. Interesting. Yeah, there's for sure a difference between tahara, ritual purity, and all the other segments of halacha. So that just looking around over here, it looks like there's a million different interpretations, nuanced interpretations of this Gemara. What's l'chomili? Rabbi Shimon says in every sense, a punctured pot is like an unperforated pot. It's like it's detached from the ground. L'Shabbos, for the purposes of Shabbos, for liknos, for Mashicha, and for an acquisition. Anyways, bottom line is, for any halacha where something needs to be on the ground, a perforated flower pot is considered not the ground. For the laws of Shabbos, it's not in the ground. For the laws of acquisition, it's not considered in the ground. And there are a number of other halachas that have to take place on the earth, on the ground, and a flower pot, even if it's perforated according to Rabbi Shimon, is not considered attached. All right. Let us continue in the Gemara. And the Gemara is now going to ask a question that a picture that I kind of referenced. And it's going to also force us to reimagine what our flower pot looks like and what's it do. A certain Sava, a certain old scholar, asked the following question of Rabbi Zera. Who was this Zaken? So there's a variety of interpretations who he might have been. There's even an opinion brought that it could be Eliyahu Hanavi, is referred to as Hahu's Saba, that grandfather. It doesn't seem that it's strongly embraced, but Tosfos quotes in another Gemara that sometimes Hahu Saba could mean Eliyahu Hanavi, and then the Gemara, then Tosfos rejects it. We'll see that when we get to Gemara in Chulin, which is towards the end of the Gemara. All right, here's the question. Shoresh kineged nekev ma. What if the root of the plant is right near the hole. Shoyresh kineged nekev. The roots are right opposite the hole. Mali Amar Rabbi Shimon. How would Rabbi Shimon interpret this scenario? Rashi. Mimoida deha b'mechuberhu. Hi shoyresh. Would Rabbi Shimon, who almost always says a perforated pot is considered detached. Well, what if a root is just about going to go through that hole? Is it still considered uprooted? Or being that this root is connected to the earth, do we now say that it is attached to the ground? And so I think, if you leave a flower pot for a long time, if there's a hole in it, and I think most flower pots, do have a hole in the bottom. Is that correct? Today, for the water to drain through and...
Yes, because otherwise the roots rot.
So you need to have... So if you leave a flower pot long enough, assuming the plant stays alive, the roots are going to make their way through it. So although usually Rabbi Shimon says just because there's a hole in the pot, it doesn't mean it's attached to the ground. But here, would he agree that this plant is considered attached to the ground? And therefore, if you uprooted this plant, you are chayiv. Now, what really are we describing over here? Are we saying that you're allowed to uproot the plant that's going through the hole? Or are we just saying that the stuff that's on top of the pot, maybe that's considered detached? But anyways, let's see the answer. You know what the answer was? Ishtik v'la amar le midi. Rabbi Zera didn't say anything. He didn't respond. He got a question. He didn't respond. Why didn't he respond? Let's see. Another time, the same rabbi, the Husava, finds Rabbi Zera. He found him teaching and saying as follows. Rabbi Shimon admits that if a planter, a flower pot, is punctured to the point that it's such a big hole that the flower pot is considered halachically broken. What's the significance of a flower pot being considered halachically broken? Very simple. A earthenware vessel, if it becomes impure, you can't tovel it in the mikvah. It's considered perpetually tameh until it's broken beyond repair. So a hole that makes the pot considered not useful, then Rabbi Shimon will say such a pot is not a flower pot. It's broken up. The plant's now going to go into the ground. Rashi. If the flower pot was punctured in a way that the hole would have made an impure pot, tahar, it's so broken. V'hainu, how big is that hole? The size of an olive. If the earthenware pot used for food is punctured, the hole the size of an olive makes it disqualified. Rabbi Shimon says a pot that has a big gaping hole the size that an olive will just fall out, that's not a kli anymore. There's no flower pot. You're looking at a mirage. You see the walls of the flower pot, you think, oh, this is entirely detached from the ground. No, because that hole makes it practically useless. So this is another teaching of Rabbi Zera. When I wanted to ask you about a root, you had no answer. You should have a similar.
In the case of a large hole, it's considered mechubar because there's no cleat.
It's considered mechubar because there's really nothing blocking between the plant and the ground. So the scholar says, you didn't tell me about a small root coming through a hole, but its hole is large enough to render it pure. Do you need to tell me that? What does he mean? The habalon is fuke bebahanach. Oh, interesting. I'm talking about a hole where the roots are actually going to go through it, and you didn't have an answer. Here, I'm just talking about a hole that's not even corresponding to the roots. You should have if you don't know the answer to this, you shouldn't really have an answer to this. If you had a suffix about the roots, because the Gemara understands, at least according to the commentaries that I'm reading over here, that the reason why he didn't answer is because he didn't really know the answer. It wasn't that he didn't know. He had a suffix. He was doubtful if the halacha goes this way or that way. And so he avoided giving any solid answer. But this elder says, Rav Zera, you should have the same question about a hole the size of an olive. So Rabbi Zera, so he's basically arguing with Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera, he's saying, according to your understanding, you should have a problem here. And ultimately, Rabbi Zera did paskin that it's considered connected to the ground. Again, what's more connected to the ground? A root actually going through a hole, or a hole on the side that's pretty that's big. So you think a root actually going out would be a more clear-cut problem. And so this Saba, this old scholar, basically is rejecting Rabbi Zera's explanation over here. Let's see if Rabbi Steinsaltz agrees with my interpretation here. Now I raise a dilemma to you where the root is opposite the hole and you didn't say anything. In regards to a case where the root is not actually opposite the hole, but there's just a big hole, you have clarity. The dilemma, whether or not it's considered attached, is resolved. Rather, this must be understood differently. Amar Abaya, if you want to understand what Rabbi Zera really was trying to say, here's what you got to explain. Rabbi Shimon agrees. Dr. Stamler, I think this is your question. If the puncture was in the very bottom of the pot, what does that mean? I believe it means at the point where you will not even be able to hold a small measure of liquid on the bottom of the pot. Depending how high on the pot the puncture is, depends on how much volume the flower pot can hold. If the puncture is at the very bottom, Mark, how much is the revius? 3 ounces, 4 ounces, 2.5 ounces, something like that.
3.5 ounces.
I'm sorry?
3 ounces. 3 to 3.5 ounces.
Something in the ballpark of 2, something from 2 point whatever, 2 and a fraction to 4 ounces. Not a lot of water for a flower pot. Not a lot of water for a flower pot. So Abaya says what Rabbi Zera actually said was not this, but he must have said if the puncture is low down on the pot, then it's considered attached to the ground. Rabbi Shimon, if it's punctured at the bottom of the pot, then it should be considered Rashi. So Abaya had a different quote, a different tradition of what Rabbi Zera was saying. Here we say Rabbi Zera says if it was a massive hole, it's considered attached to the ground. Abaya had a different record of what he said. He basically said if the puncture is towards the bottom of the pot, well, now the pot and the plants within it are considered attached to the ground.
2.9 ounces, actually.
2.9. Okay. According to what?
According to I have that app, the iPruta app, which says all the. It says 86 milliliters, which comes out to 2.9.
Shkayach for looking that up. So basically, something just under 3 to 3.5. Hachi itmar. Rashi explains. If the pot cannot even hold a revius of liquid, it's not even a clear. It's the punctures from the bottom. So this statement of Abaya, I think, compels us to reimagine what we're talking about. Because our default, when we read the Mishnah, the default understanding of the Mishnah was that we're talking about a hole in the bottom of the pot. Where else would the hole be? But now, based on this Gemara, we say Rabbi Shimon would actually consider a pot with a hole in the bottom or close to the bottom. That's considered, it's open. What good is a pot if there's a hole in the bottom? And think about it. The roots go downwards. And so it's inevitable that they're going to attach to the ground. If it's off to the side, that's where Rabbi Shimon, and ostensibly that's where the Mishnah is debating about. Now we're going to take a little bit of a small detour. So again, our Mishnah told us a machlekes about what to do with a perforated pot. That's basically what the Mishnah was talking about. The first opinion, Rabbi Yehuda says it is considered attached to the ground, you're chayiv, and Rabbi Shimon says you're potter. And our Gemara had a little bit of a lengthy dialogue between Rabbi Zera and Sava and Abaya and Rava about what exactly or when exactly Rabbi Shimon would concede. We have the possibility that Rabbi Shimon would concede a big hole, makes the pot considered not a pot, and therefore the plants are attached to the ground. And then Abaya quoted Rabbi Zera as saying, Rabbi Shimon certainly would agree if the hole is on the bottom of the pot, it's considered attached to the ground. So the whole subject of Atzis Nakov just became a whole lot more complicated, especially Dr. Stamler, I think you said that today you go to a store or you go and you want to buy a plant in a flower pot for yourself, you want to give it as a gift. Well, take a look at that pot and inevitably the hole is going to be quite smack on the bottom. So if that's the case, certainly the way Rabbi Zera is explaining it, everybody would agree that you shouldn't uproot a plant that's on the soil, on the ground, if it has a hole right on the bottom. Maybe if it was a full-fledged whole pot, assuming it was of the right material and assuming the puncture was in the right place, maybe then there would be a suffix. So Reb Beryl, your initial assertion was correct. Leave the plant alone. Don't touch it. Wait till after Shabbos.
I presume they're all talking about a plant sitting on the ground because
Correct.
the roots eventually will take over the whole plant and the pot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Now we're going to take a little bit of another detour. What's this detour? So today you get a little hole in your vessel, you throw it out. Today we live in a world, at the moment, there's plenty. There's a relative degree of affluence. And if something has a little hole or broke, we will happily get rid of it. Or we'll fix it. But once upon a time, it wasn't so simple. If you had a keli, it means that someone had to make it by hand. And you weren't going to just throw something out because there's a small hole. And so there are a variety of halachically relevant discussions about your earthenware vessel when it starts to break or develop a little hole. These are halachically relevant discussions about if the halacha of these vessels. To get more specific than that, we could just take a look at the Gemara.
Rabbi, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
If you have a pot
Mhm.
with herbs in it
Yes.
and Shabbos,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to use the herbs on Shabbos, are you permitted to remove some of the leaves in order to use it or not?
Certainly not. Certainly
That's
not.
what I figured, but I figured, let me ask.
Certainly not. The question would be, what is your avera? Is it biblical? Is it rabbinic? But certainly we should not be uprooting plants that are growing.
Well, you're not uprooting. I'm not talking uprooting. I'm talking. I mean.
No, I mean you're plucking a leaf off it. You're plucking.
Right.
You're essentially harvesting a little piece of herb to put into your salad.
No, I just thought maybe because you need it to eat. I mean, you can. If
so you're asking,
you'll have to open up a can or whatever.
So you're asking an interesting question, which is on Yontif.
If you want to eat it, well, are you permitted or not permitted?
So it's an interesting question. Your question is, can you harvest stuff on Yontif? And assuming you can't, why not? So let's leave that for another time, but it's a good question. And it's a sugya.
Rabbi, I think it's a very serious question because I'm amazed how many people are growing stuff in their kitchen, cloves and all these things, and they go to make a salad. They're a gardener.
Yeah. So before Shabbos, you should make sure to cut off and pluck your mint and your bay leaves and your oregano and whatever else you're going to put in your salad. Make sure to do it. Alon helps there on the shul. So he actually planted on the side of the shul a big oregano plant and lemongrass. So actually, we've never used it, but there's actually a big wild oregano bush. I never knew they become bushes. I've always seen these little right out on the side of the shul. So, anyways, Amar Rava, Chamesh Midos B'Kli Cheres. There are 5 different relevant measurements to keep in mind about the halachas of your earthenware plants, mostly connected to the laws of purity and impurity. What does purity and impurity have to do with a pot? Very simple. As we said, an earthenware pot that becomes impure is tummy. When it becomes decommissioned or broken, maybe it becomes tar. So let's figure out if and when a pot can still convey impurity. There are 5 measures that are important to keep in mind when it comes to an earthenware pot. Number 1, Nikev kimoitzi mashka. If a pot no longer can hold water, there is a hole enough to allow liquid to drip out, to seep out. Tahar, it now becomes pure. Militame gistra.
Of course, I cheated and looked at the
I'm sorry?
English. I think that becomes when it comes to a broken vessel, it becomes pure again.
Right. No, yeah. I mean, that's what it says. It becomes, but the specifics. Oh, you know, Rabbi Steinfeld seems certain shards of impure earthenware vessels remain impure if they can be used. If it has a hole, even a small. This is where Rashi. Even if it has a hole, even a small one that liquid can flow through, it can no longer transmit ritual impurity. And so the keli itself does not become tahar, but in as much as this might one day become a shard, that hole prevents it from becoming ritually impure as a shard. But a vessel that has a hole enough that liquid can seep out remains kosher, remains considered a keli for the purifying waters of the para aduma. When the para aduma, the red heifer, ashes are administered for someone that is ritually impure, the water and the ashes were administered by a kohen. It had to be in a keli. It says, "V'nasan olav mayim chayim el keli." There was water, fresh water from a spring that was attached to the vessel. Although this hole is sufficient to make a shard, not mikabel tuma, it is considered, meaning that it's not a kli. It was considered a kli for the purposes of mei chatos, for the waters of the para aduma. Let's read some Rashis here, even though maybe it'll confuse us. But Koloimar, im kli shalimhu, ein initer bekach. If the vessel's whole, it does not become pure. But if this little puncture, this perforation, enough that water can leak out, happened to a shard, and the shard still was potentially able to be used, recycled, to mekabel tuma mishenishbar, it's still, if it's still usable, it can become tamei. Anyways, if this shard that's now useful, which became tahar, now becomes impure again. The shard, because it has this little hole, it's not considered a kli for the purposes of a shard. Rashi, what is gistra? Shever kli, a broken fragment of a kli. By the way, today, if you're an archaeologist, all you're uncovering, if you're lucky, is a gistra. The odds of you finding a whole vessel from the time of the Mishnah, unfortunately, is fairly low, although I think it happens. A broken piece of a shard, you might keep. But if the shard also has a hole, says Rashi, then you no longer want to hold on to it. And you say, you know what, I'll take another shard and let this one. What does it mean that you can still use a vessel that has this hole for the paraduma? If the vessel's whole, and there's a little hole enough that water can drip out. It still has all of the halachic ramifications and parameters of being a vessel. Even for a very important matter where you are biblically mandated to have a whole vessel, it is still considered a full keli, which is interesting. So the first measure to keep in mind is if the hole is enough for water to leak out, but it is so small that if you were to place it into a puddle, water would not seep in. What if the hole is a little bigger and the hole is enough? If you'd place it into water, water would seep in. This is a hole that has some space. It's easier for water to leak out of a keli than to seep into a small hole. True. What happens if it has that kind of hole? Tahar l'kadesh by mechatas. it is no longer suitable to use for mechatos, for the purification ritual of the para aduma. This is a funny word, by the way. Mark, I saw a few of you flinch. Tahar usually means pure. But when we're talking about using a vessel for the para aduma, we don't care if it's, we care that it's pure. And we're talking about if it's considered a vessel. But in the context of our text here, tahar, pure, equals no longer useful as a keli, because an impure keli becomes tar when it's broken. So tahar, ironically, here means broken. No longer good. That's what Rashi explains. Tahar lavdafka. We don't mean ritual purity. It loses its previous status as a vessel. But it is still halachically considered a vessel, so that if there were seeds inside of the pot, they are considered detached from the ground. Remember before we were talking about attached to the ground, not attached to the ground for the purpose of seeds? Well, a hole that allows water to seep in, maybe you can't use it for the most important function, but it's considered detached from the ground for the purposes of causing seeds to become ritually impure. Next, third measure. Nikiv kesherish katan, if the hole is the size of a small root, this is even a little larger than the size that water can flood. A solid now is pushing through. Now the seeds inside of it are not considered apart from the ground. But it is considered a vessel that is susceptible to ritual impurity, because you can still use the pot or the basket that has a little hole the size of a root to gather olives. Once upon a time, olives was a massive industry in Israel. And just because you had a small hole, it doesn't mean you can't use it for a primary use, such as collecting olives. Rashi. Now, of course, Rashi is going to explain to us there's another reason, how important halachic reason why we talk about olives, because shehu shir l'tuma b'chol kli cheres ha'aseh la'oichlin. When it comes to a food vessel, the default size that's considered not capable of holding food is an olive size. Olives are considered like a small, today we'd say it's like the size of a small pasta, right? Maybe you'll say the size of a macaroni. I don't know. Can you tell I have little kids in my house? But in the time of the Mishnah, the Gemara, and in Halacha, the size that an olive can fall through, that's considered no longer able to hold the standard small size of food. Again, I'm sorry?
Pretty big hole if an olive will fall through.
Yeah, if an olive can fall out, we're talking about a pretty big hole. Any earthenware vessel used for food? I'm sorry?
Usually you refer to holding liquid for at least a reasonable amount of time. You know, if it's a small hole where it seeps out, but you can still use it.
Right, but here we're talking about a keli that you use not for holding liquids, but for holding food, solids. And so it's still useful. A little hole doesn't make it not suitable for use, so long as it can still contain olives. The Rashi points out, this is stam, but you could still say that this basket's not for olives, but it's for a basket of pomegranates. Pomegranates are a good bit larger than olives, and a hole the size of an olive is still, it's problematic to hold olives or grapes or pomegranate seeds, but it's enough to hold full pomegranates. So that's what the Gemara says. Nikiv k'maitzi zeisim, if the hole is the size that a olive would fall through, tahar milakabel by zeisim, it is now considered tar. It's no longer considered a kli because it cannot hold olives. Adayin kli will the kabel by reminding, but you can still designate it as a pomegranate holder. Rashi, it's considered tar. But if you said, you know what, I'm going to now use this for pomegranates, it can now once again be susceptible to ritual impurity going forward. If you used it for, and if you were always using it for pomegranates, it didn't become tar, because just because you have a hole the size of an olive, that doesn't mean that you cannot use it for pomegranates. Again, today, we would just throw it out. But
and there's no end to this, because what if I want to keep watermelons in it?
So let's see. Nikiv k'maitzi remind him tar miklum. If it has the size of a pomegranate, now this vessel is under normal average. This is no longer susceptible to impurity. It is considered utterly broken. Rashi says, except if you're going to use it as a shard, which then it could become. V'im haya mukev tzamid pasil ad sheyipaches rubai. But if, let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz's translations, and then we're going to call it a day. If it was surrounded by a covered seal, so although it's broken, but it's covered up by another covering, well, then it's considered a keli until it's more than 50% broken. Maybe tomorrow we'll pick up and talk a little more about this last line and then go on to the Gemara. Friends, yes, today was an interesting, different, and somewhat challenging Gemara. We have to imagine scenarios and images that we haven't discussed recently. And I want to thank you all for your wisdom, your insights, your feedback. And may Hashem truly bless everyone here with good gesund for ourselves, families, friends, with only good news, and menuchas hanefesh for all of Klal Yisrael. Dr. Pasternak, I believe Rabbi Shalmer is off for today again. I hope tomorrow he'll resume. But again, I don't believe he's doing Chumash today. So, gentlemen, shkoyach, thank you all for being here. Have a blessed and wonderful day. And I look forward to seeing everyone Be'ezer Hashem tomorrow. Gesundheit and Freilich.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care, everyone.
Shkoyach.